Hey everybody, welcome back to the Personal Transformation Podcast. My name is Dan Storey and I'm joined today by an expert in imposter syndrome, Tara Halliday. Tara, hi, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dan. Delighted to be here.
The audience won't know this, but there was an element of synchronicity that happened for this call. So all of the conversations I've had since publishing the book have focused on pretty much one topic, which is, yes, Dan, I get this idea that I've got to set a goal and transform. But as soon as I do that, I feel like a fraud. I feel like a fake. And there's no way that I'm going to be able to achieve this challenge, this goal that I've set for myself. And in the book, I talk about we create an identity, a bigger identity for ourselves, this self-image that we want to achieve and strive for. But our existing self-image says, nah, that's not you. Who are you trying to fool? And so we have this battle between our current self-image and our future desired self-image. And I think, there's a few different terms for that, but you've kind of really attached to this idea that is imposter syndrome. So tell us a little bit about your journey. Why imposter syndrome? Because I think you're an engineer at heart. So how has this journey happened for you?
Yes, well, when I have to rewind, back in time till I was 13, deciding what I wanted to do in my life. I wanted to be a psychologist. My family wouldn't let me, so I ended up in engineering, and so I had a 10-year diversion into engineering, and then I came back and I did my training in holistic therapy and started from there. So the engineering got away from pretty quickly, and then I was working with people just in a general sense. And sometimes people wouldn't just, feel better and go away, which is the whole point. Sometimes they kept coming back, which is definitely not the point to be a crutch, right?
Yep.
And, I don't have to be with you for 20 years in supporting your life, no. And so maybe the engineer in me wanted to know why. And so I dug into it, and it turned out to be a set of beliefs. And so I dug further into beliefs, and I came across this rather obscure coaching method around conditional worth. And we can get in a little bit later, which is very interesting. So I trained in it, and it was amazing and had this huge transformation for people. And I was very excited by it. And so I was working exclusively in that area. And one of my clients came to me and said, well, is this imposter syndrome? And this was 2016, and at that point I hadn't heard of imposter syndrome. It was only like the year before started becoming something that people were talking about publicly. And I'm like, I don't know, I'll have a look. And I looked into it, and what I saw was this massive light bulb moment. The work that I'd been doing in conditional worth, all the symptoms of it are exactly the same as imposter syndrome. So we've got this correlation between imposter syndrome and conditional worth. And for me, I thought, okay, here's something that people are starting to identify because they can see the symptoms. Let's focus on that. So that was the turning point for me, where I started focusing on imposter syndrome, and then went into all sorts of, researched all the academic literature and what everyone was saying, and hundreds of interviews. And I started from there, really.
Fantastic. So you're working a lot with executives, and we're going to try and focus this conversation on the workplace, because I think there's so much of an application for it in that space. I mean, if you set a goal, a personal goal or something, then you're not going to feel like you're going to make it, but it really shows up in people in the office and in work and leaders. And I think for me, it's either when you set a goal or you get pushed into a position of authority that this gap arises.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've recently been talking about it. It's either like a promotion, or if you become a parent, like that's the other one as well. Is when you become a parent, like, oh my goodness, they've just given me this small person. How am I going to deal with this? There's no freaking way. Yeah. So is all imposter syndrome the same? Does it show up at particular times? How does it show up for people?
Okay, so there's a lot in there. Firstly, in the workplace, right? You're absolutely right. It affects 70% of high achievers at some point in their careers, and the reason that it shows up mostly in the workplace and mostly with high achievers is coming back to what you were saying about identity. People identify with their work, and when they get to be successful, this gap between being successful and not feeling it becomes more and more obvious. So I think that's why. So imposter syndrome is the secret feeling that you're a fraud when you're not a fraud. and with it comes the fear of being found out. So it creates this massive stress, and it really is this it's called a cognitive dissonance, where you believe two things at the same time. Your brain gets stressed out by that.
Yeah.
And logically, intellectually, you know that you're competent and you're capable, but internally you're just not feeling it, and it creates a lot of stress and a lot of confusion. So that's really what imposter syndrome is, and where it shows up. And then how it looks. There are three groups of symptoms, if you like. So there's three areas. Firstly is the imposter syndrome thinking. The imposter syndrome thoughts: I don't feel quite good enough. It's self-criticism, self-doubt, self-judgment, feeling that you just got lucky, feeling like at any moment someone's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. You have to leave, right?
Yeah.
It's that. And what goes on in the brain where you have that kind of, looking out for being caught out, is it triggers the nervous system response, and it triggers you into fight, flight, or freeze state. So that's the second symptom group, is the physiological response to it. So people go into fight, flight, and freeze. It throws everything into the air in terms of their physiology, their thinking, their ability to be present, everything. It creates tension, stress, anxiety, and overwhelm. So that's something that people notice a lot. And then because they've got the stress going on, then it drives them to a coping behavior. And there are specific coping behaviors that relate to imposter syndrome. We can define them as hiding behaviors or striving behaviors. So a hiding behavior is one where you try and almost keep yourself out of the spotlight. So it's keeping it a secret, not telling anyone you're feeling this way. It's avoiding opportunities that might come up, turning down promotions to get offered, or projects, or not putting forward for a particular contract because you don't think you're going to get it. It's not just avoiding the opportunities. You might not speak up quite enough. So now I've got to say, this isn't low confidence or low self-esteem. This is, leaders, professional people. It's considered normal functioning in the psychology world. So it doesn't need psychotherapy. It doesn't need medication or anything like that. But it just takes your focus away from everything. So you might not speak up enough or as much as you'd like to. Procrastination comes into there as well, which is a common one. So that's the hiding behaviors to keep you out of the spotlight. Or you might do the striving behaviors. The striving behaviors are ones where you feel that you're not quite good enough, and so you try to push yourself to be better. So that's where perfectionism comes in, over preparing for things, feeling like you even though you're fully qualified, that you don't have quite enough qualifications, gritting your teeth and pushing through. Those are so you've got these two types of behaviors, and they're not just habits. So people try and fix them as habits, right? They're actually being driven by this stress, and because they make you less present, less productive, they're very frustrating. People then judge themselves, and that loops around to the cycle of feeding into the imposter syndrome, thinking maybe they really aren't good enough, and the cycle goes around and around. And that's really why imposter syndrome is quite a complex issue, because it's these things feeding onto each other.
No, it's fascinating. I've been doing some work with mental toughness, and one of the elements of mental toughness is confidence and abilities, right? There's a separate score. And some of the people I've been working with, like you say, these are some senior people. There's some, they're not just like at the beginning of their career, they are way up there. Yes. And they're scoring so low on confidence abilities, and they're in a massively senior role. And I'm like, so how does this show up? And I think you're right. Many of them are just trying to, they either hide, they're trying not to expose themselves further, or they go to their safe space, which is what they used to do. So they almost regress career-wise and not dive into the kind of challenges they faced. I like the over-preparing one. Like you said, striving behaviors, I thought that sounded good, but it seems like it's too far the other way, or potentially could be too far if they overdo it. Yeah, I think I was just looking this morning in preparation for this. This sounds, and I've experienced it. You said 70% of people get it. I've definitely experienced this from time to time, and I think the opposite of this, because there is always the opposite, is called the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is that the complete opposite, which is like I've got no ability, but I feel insanely good about myself. So I guess it is a continuum of like feeling, right?
The Dunning-Kruger effect is interesting. So there is a process that one goes through in learning, right? You start off, you don't know what you don't know, right? It's called unconscious incompetence. You don't know what you don't know, and that is Dunning-Kruger, right? It's that. Well, how hard can it be? Because you've got no idea, right? And that's Dunning-Kruger. And then you move to, you've learned some things, you've got some skills. So now you've got to conscious incompetence. Now you realize how big the problem is because you know a bit more about it. And you realize also that you're not fully trained. When you get to that conscious competence, right? When you know that you can do something and you can do it, that's where imposter syndrome strikes. So a lot of people, I think you mentioned it, a lot of people talk about imposter syndrome in terms of being in the learning zone, when you're new to something, when you're trying something new and you're expanding or something like that. That can be a trigger, but that's not where imposter syndrome really stands out and has the most impact. It's where you're in that conscious competence and still you feel like you're not quite good enough. And that's why it's so painful. And it tends to really only dawn on people in the later stages of their careers that this is a repeating pattern.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So your original studying, I think you said conditional worth. So let's is there a cause to it? Because if I think conditional worth, I'm saying, okay, well, this is where I want to be. This is who I think I am if I get this much admiration, praise, etc., reinforcement. Is this caused by people putting too much pressure on their work identity? Is there a particular pattern of things that you see emerging?
Right. So brilliant question. So conditional worth is a belief, and this is the root cause of imposter syndrome. So we've talked about the symptoms, right? Well, what's driving those symptoms is this belief in conditional worth. And by conditional worth, I mean we merge who we are and what we do, right? And then if we do something good, we are good. If we do something bad, we are bad. Because the way that we think about ourselves, this is on this roller coaster, right? Sometimes we feel great and sometimes we don't. And that is really what's the whole thing that's driving imposter syndrome. Where this comes from, though, is actually a childhood thing. It was actually identified back in the 1950s by Dr. Carl Rogers, one of the granddaddies of personal psychology. And he'd gone on this quest to find the root cause of human suffering, right? And he found it. He found that it was this, because his question was, why, when we have food, shelter, clothing, safety, are we still unhappy? Why are we still miserable? Why are we still stressed? And he identified it as conditional worth. And so what happens when a baby's born, it has no structure in terms of the world. It gets all this information coming in and it's all blurred together. It's all one mush. And then as the brain starts to develop, it starts to categorize things, build this internal representation of the world. When they get to between 18 months and 3 years old, the child starts developing a sense of themselves as separate being from other beings, separate, and as as a father of a young child, you've seen this emergent self, right? At that point would have been the time at which we could have separated out this idea that our worth as a human is related to what we do. We could have separated them out. For the vast majority of people, and this is across the world, that doesn't happen. So the conditional worth belief, which is this idea that these two emerged, is so pervasive in our society that nobody knows to teach it to children. So this is why Carl Rogers, when he was exploring it, he said, well, I found it, but there's nothing we can do about it because you should have learned it in childhood. There's nothing we can do to change.
Yeah.
Well, the good news is Like neuroscience has moved on, and there are ways to change that conditional worth belief. And when we change that conditional worth belief, then imposter syndrome goes away.
Yep.
And that's the work that I do. That's a fair thing.
Perfect. So we're going to come to that work in a moment, but I've got my parent hat on. So, and I know a lot of people that listen to this are in the parenting zone. So, we're all kind of going through that challenge of how do I not break my kids? So to get in advance, so we try and cure imposter syndrome before it arises, is there like 2 or 3 tips that you can give to parents? What should we be doing or not doing with our kids that we are currently doing that you say, stop it?
Okay, all right. So the very first thing is to acknowledge that this conditional worth belief is unconscious, right? So it's not something we're doing deliberately. So we teach it because we were never taught it ourselves, and we're unaware of it. It's like, pick another language that you don't speak. How could you have taught your daughters to speak if you didn't even know the language yourself? So this is what we're talking about. So there's no blame, there's no one's fault, and there's no trauma here. Now, what you have to recognize is this shows up absolutely everywhere. So you will be teaching your child this belief that you hold unconsciously, consistently. Okay. So first step in any change, as your book says, is awareness, right? Yep. Become aware of it. Okay, now there's things you can do. For example, one thing we do is ask kids what you want to be when you grow up. Not what you want to do. And you see, we've mixed this with this who you are and
Yep.
So rather than ask the child, what do you want to do when you grow up? Or even, not to tie them to one thing, what things would you like to do? What things would you like to explore and master and get excited about? Right? So we're still asking the same question, right? This future visioning of yourself as an adult, but we're not putting it in terms of identity, and we're not putting it in terms of who we are is what we do. And the other thing is the good girl, bad girl, good boy, bad boy, right? So you can see, we even say it to the dog, right? So they'll hear it so many times. So instead of praising kids for what they've done and being the judge of it, right? Turn it around and, okay, what did you enjoy about that? What did you learn about that? So there's no, I'm a good person because I got an A, or I'm a bad person because I got a D. And the more that you can separate that out for your child, the better it's going to be for them.
I love it. I'm gonna just call myself a solid B on parenting, then, based on that lesson. No, it's so important, right? Separating the identity from the thing, and I'm consciously aware of trying not to say naughty. Like naughty is the one, and she's at that age now where there's a lot of naughty things happening, and she's not naughty, but the thing that she did is naughty.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And you can even say, you can say it in terms of we don't jump on the sofa.
Yeah.
Rather than it's naughty or bad to jump on the sofa. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's assume, and I'm going to say assumption with a tongue in cheek, that people listening to this are a little bit more grown up, although I'm sure there's still some jumping on the sofa that does take place from time to time. So how can so-called grown-ups deal with imposter syndrome? How do you take people through a journey of reprogramming or rewiring whatever their thought process is so they can be a bit more functional?
Yeah, so this is the work I do, and I've suggested it. The work that I do is I work on people's conditional worth in the context of imposter syndrome and get them to a point where they have unconditional worth, so change that belief, and then the imposter syndrome falls away, and it's in a permanent way. So it's a very structured program because turns out there are different kinds of belief. As you know, I know you've been dealing with beliefs for all your career. There are different kinds of beliefs. So there's one kind of belief which is, and this is how we typically think of beliefs, which is our opinions. How your favorite football team is going to do next year, or beliefs about what the stock market is going to do next year. You can go deeper into beliefs, what do you believe, what do you think, what's your opinions about the world around you. So those are kind of conscious things. Then we get to a group of beliefs which are the automatic and unconscious operation of the brain.
Yep.
So thinking is a very expensive process for the brain, takes up 20% of the body's calories. So the brain tries to put everything as automatic as possible. So, for example, you trust when you're crossing the road, you trust that the pavement's going to support your weight. You don't have to tap your toe out and check it's not quicksand at every step, right? So this is what I mean about that belief, that automatic assumption that the road will support you. That's how you can drive to work in the morning and not remember the journey at all, because your brain has been on automatic, which it's supposed to do. Right? So those are those kind of beliefs. They're still beliefs that the brain holds about the world, its model of the world. And there's another group of beliefs, it's a smaller set of that, which is the beliefs that of what is a threat, what is a danger to you. So these are held as a part of the brain called the amygdala. There's two sides in front of the ears, behind the eyes. And the amygdala is like the filter. So where you have your email spam filter, right? It catches the email before it gets to your inbox and checks it. Is this a threat? Now, what the spam filter does is it puts it into a little box, and so you don't get exposed to it. What the brain does, what the amygdala does, it also gets the information a few milliseconds before you're thinking about it, and it puts it through the filter. It's got this like checklist of what's a danger. And those are, and if it finds a danger, then it triggers your nervous system, right, to fight, flight, flee, survival threats.
Yeah.
And conditional worth is in that group of beliefs.
Interesting.
So in order to change that belief, we have to almost do some brain engineering in this. We have to get quite clever in terms of how we modulate that. There's been some breakthroughs in the last 10 years in terms of psychology. Something called memory reconsolidation, which is how we can take one of those unconscious amygdala held beliefs and we can set it up in a particular way. If you like, I can go into the detail.
Well, I think we might in a minute, yeah, but
yeah. So set it up in a particular way to change, so we can change that belief and then let it go again. And what happens is that the charge of it goes away and it gets rid of it for good. So it's a permanent shift. And this is what we can do for conditional worth as well.
Amazing. Okay, so let's unpack that, because I like the analogy of the spam filter. And yeah, maybe we need to train our amygdala so that it doesn't just throw it in our face and say, hey, you've got to deal with this immediately. It just stores it in a little spam filter out to the side. Maybe we can retrain it to do that. Because, I think about times in the past where I've had like maybe a big client will call me and, it's out of the blue. I'm not expecting this call. And you're like, oh, you immediately think the worst, right? You immediately think, oh, they're going to fire me or something's wrong or something like that. None of the good things come into your head. Why? It's that kind of idea, right? So this is the amygdala say, hey, warning, there's probably something that's going to go wrong here. You should deal with it. So, okay, well, take us through some of that then. How do we start to unpack that? How do we first, I mean, we're probably all aware of it. We know some of our triggers. But how do you start to, I guess, separate the event from the reaction?
Right. So the way that the amygdala stores it, because it is memories, it stores it together with the emotion. Right.
Okay.
So it stores it. They're called fear memories, and they're stored together as one entity. So that when you recall a particular event, for example, that was startling or scary or something, you replay the emotion that goes with it. And so the brain learns this automatically. So none of this was from our conscious thinking, right? This is an amygdala. It learned it itself, the way it learned it. So last year I was getting out of the shower, reached for the bath towel, and there was this enormous spider. I had a little bit of a freak out, right? and it was startling. And I found myself, even a year later, I found myself shaking out a towel before I went getting out of the shower. So my brain had learned it. And the way it learns it is that, okay, so let's go a bit more into neuroscience. When we were learning, as a child, putting together our model of the world, the brain was very, very flexible, forming billions of neural connections and pruning them, sorting them out. The neuroscience scientists have found that it was doing so in the presence of a chemical called acetylcholine. And the acetylcholine basically allowed those things to form and learn and be shaped. When we're an adult, so we've got now this, decades worth of experience that the brain doesn't want to lose, because this is what's keeping us safe, right? The brain does not want to change. This is why back in the 1950s they said the brain couldn't change. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? Yeah. Because what neuroscientists have found is that most of the brain has acetylcholine inhibitors such that it preserves it, which is wonderful. The amygdala does not have those inhibitors, because the amygdala needs to learn from things like, if we go to a tropical, we go to live somewhere tropical, and now you have to empty your shoe out just in case there's a scorpion inside, right? We have to keep learning right throughout our lives. So the amygdala still responds to acetylcholine. There are three major things that release acetylcholine. One is when something's very, very relevant to you, very, very important. So you mentioned, this big client calling up, right? There's relevance there. The other is surprise, like spider, right? It wasn't expecting it. Anytime we're surprised. And what that means for the brain is that it wasn't expecting it, so it needs to learn it, right? Yep. And then the third is strong emotion, because strong emotion comes when we get scared, when there's a threat. So when the presence of something being relevant and strong emotion and surprise, acetylcholine gets released, and the amygdala will form this fear memory. Okay, yep. So that's the formation. Now, what the memory reconsolidation, the new psychology, says that we can do is, if we kind of go back to this point, deliberately stimulate acetylcholine, then we have the opportunity either to reinforce it, because it, a genuine threat needs to be reinforced, or to overwrite it. Okay. That's what we do. So we deliberately generate acetylcholine. We then start framing things in terms of a different perspective, in terms of positive emotion. And what happens then is that fear memory, the fear part gets taken away. So we can remember an event logically, right? We can remember but we don't have that emotional reaction to it, which means the amygdala no longer puts us into the nervous system state. Okay.
So I can think back to that client call and just see it as a client call where they ask me a question, not it could be the end of the world.
Exactly, right? But you can see, like you mentioned, it was out of the blue, so you've got surprise and relevance there, right? Yeah. And then if they told you it was something bad, you would have had a strong emotion, right? Yeah. And so what we do for conditional worth, right? Now, conditional worth isn't about some event. We can't go back and reimagine the event, because there was no event that caused it. Yeah. But what we have instead is we have a belief, and then we have, throughout our lives, reinforcing situations, things that prove to you that you're not good enough. So this might be something a parent said, or a teacher said, or a peer said, or an experience that we had, and we've got stacks of them. And as far as the brain's concerned, that's proof that this is the correct belief, that we shouldn't change this. Yep. So to change it, what we do is we take these minor events and we run them through this memory reconsolidation process. And then the kind of weight of evidence for the brain is that, oh, this isn't true. And that allows us to change conditional worth.
Interesting. So I'm a CEO or some C-suite person. I don't feel like lying on the couch necessarily and going back through my childhood. Also, when you say about surprise and emotion, I have an idea of like you jumping out from behind the door and trying to reprogram people's memories as you're doing so. So like Kato from the Pink Panther. What can business leaders, what can we do on a day-to-day? How can we start to unravel this idea of imposter syndromes for ourselves? What are some of the practical things that we can do?
Yeah. So, well, if I take us back, this isn't therapy, right? So this isn't that you have to trawl through everything. This is a step-by-step process that isn't dragging you through the mud, is there anything like that? Step-by-step process that takes about 10 minutes.
Yep.
For one such event. They're not such big events that, you know, we don't go into traumas or anything like that. And so we just need, you know, 15 to 20 of those to have enough weight. So it's actually a very doable process. And it's something that then you can use going forward. If you did have something that was severe and traumatic, you can, you know, defuse the charge of it. So that's what it is. So it's effectively learning that process and doing the process, and that's what I do with executives. So it's there's no drama to it. There's no unpacking. There's no lying on a couch and talking through things. Right? We're just like bish bash bosh, getting through them, and that's what you have to do. Now, it is a very specific process. So I have outlined it in my book. So last year I published a book called Outsmart Imposter Syndrome. And I actually go through the details and the neuroscience behind it. So you can see. So there's one place that people can start.
Phenomenal. We'll send some people, because there's also a quiz on imposter syndrome on your website. So we'll send some people there in a minute so they can, because some people, do people know if it's imposter syndrome, or they doubt its ability? Or is there sometimes where people doubt their ability and they actually do not have the ability and they think it's imposter syndrome, but it's not, but it's also not Dunning-Kruger? Like, what? There must be a kind of gray area in the middle or something.
Well, people are complex. So you're right, it's gray, not black and white. The problem with what people know or think they know about imposter syndrome is that, you know, there's so much information out there that says, here's, you know, imposter syndrome, here, do this, make a list of strengths, for example, which, by the way, doesn't work. And mindset doesn't work. You see, we have to change your belief here. So telling yourself in the mirror you're good enough isn't going to work. So there's a lot of things that don't work. So back in 2020, there was this meta study put together by some researchers. They looked at the last 40 years of imposter syndrome research. It was identified back in 1978. What over the last 40 years has been done? Who gets it? So they put all this together and who gets it, what circumstances. And they were also looking for what people can do about it, what treatments there are in the literature, in academic literature about it. The shocking discovery they came across was the none. Right? There was no proven techniques. So all this advice that you get on the social media and the people saying, oh, you know, I just had to do this and I just did this, has no backing in terms of any experimental proof. Now, since then, a few things have come out. And one of the things I'm doing is I'm publishing the results of my work because it's massively effective. But yeah, there's the idea of, is this really imposter syndrome? First, you have to test it. So this is why you mentioned the quiz. The quiz is that very first step. So it's the gold standard of, do I have imposter syndrome? And you go take the test. It's 20 questions. You get a score, and if it's over 62%, then you probably want to do something about imposter syndrome because it has a massive effect. One of the research studies has linked imposter syndrome and burnout. So you know, it's a serious thing that it can lead you into a very unpleasant situation. People ending their careers even because they think it's them, and it's such a tragedy because it's not them. So imposter syndrome isn't about being a beginner. right? So imposter syndrome is affects everyone at the high, right the way up to the highest levels. I deal with, you know, CEOs and group chairmen. Meryl, take it into the entertainment world, Meryl Streep, for example, has received more acting awards than anyone else on the planet.
Yeah.
And at the beginning of each movie, in terms of the filming, she asks herself, why would anyone want to come and see me?
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a big deal, and the stress that it causes is just terrible.
It is, and stress is the hardest part, right? And like you say, if you don't know what it is, so if you can't diagnose exactly what it is, then that's a challenge. If you think it's only you,
Yeah.
then that becomes an issue. It's like, oh, it must just be me, I'm broken. It's not. Like, a lot of people have this.
Mm-hmm.
And like you say, and if there's no specific treatment, and this is the challenge with so many psychological treatments, is it's not the treatment itself, but it's the practitioner. This is what everything says, right? It's the relationship with the practitioner that is curative, not necessarily the treatment. So I look forward to you publishing your study and getting the reviews and seeing if that's it, because there definitely seems something in that kind of belief detachment, like you are not your identity.
Yes. Yes, and that is really the cause of it. That's what we're getting to, and the you know, the work that I've done takes people. You know, I score people. Here's the numbers. I score people out of 10 in terms of their particular, because not everyone has all the symptoms, right? They have a particular profile of all those symptoms that I mentioned, right? You score each of those out of 10. We take the top few. So. And then we look at them before the program and then after the program. Before the program, the average is 8.3 out of 10, as in high, significant. After the program, the average is 2.9. It's a massive, massive shift, and gone from significant stress to insignificant.
So I'll play devil's advocate. Can we ever get to zero? Is there ever a point, if you're someone in that 70% who has experienced imposter syndrome, do we ever get to zero, or is there always that little element that just niggles in the back and says, yeah, but do you remember that time?
Yeah, and so that does go away. So many of my clients get to a zero, say on their over preparing, right? So here's one of them. They did it habitually. They over prepare, and people start off with a score, and they do get to zero in that. They're not doing it anymore at all. And you get to where you forget to doubt yourself, right? So it's not like you're suppressing the doubt or trying to overwrite it or anything like that. Literally doesn't occur to you.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think imposter syndrome is like driving with the handbrake on, you know, the parking brake. You know, it drags you back, holds you down, wears you out, you know, is really bad for everyone involved.
Yeah.
And when you take that off, it does go away. Now, the reason it's 2.9 is people are complex. Say you've got something like procrastination, which also can go to zero. There's also a habitual element to that as well. So here's a habit change. So first, make the big leap down in terms of, you know, down to a small number, and then the habit change will work. It's something else people try with imposter syndrome with the symptoms. They try habit change.
Yep.
There are some wonderful habit change processes out there, very strongly backed by scientific research, but they don't work if it's got an imposter syndrome element to it.
Yeah.
So when we take out the imposter syndrome element, then that habit change is then straightforward and easy to do. No,
I love it. It's such great, like, just insights into this, because like I said, it slows people down, and it's you know, we don't need to go fast all the time, but we can't always be pulling this weight around. It just is exhausting, right? Like you say, people will suffer from burnout. So I think we need to accept that, you know, there's work to be done internally, as well as the discipline of showing up as we're doing that work, I think is super important. So Tara, this has been great. So we're kind of running out of time. It's a shame we should have to do episode 2. Imposter syndrome, the son of imposter syndrome. what's the one message? What's the one thing? If people only listen to one thing in this podcast, what's the one message you want them to take away from today?
If I can give a 3-part message.
Go on then.
And you've already said it. It's not you, right?
Mm.
But it's also not who you are. It's not your personality, right? We saw it's just a misstep in our development that's nobody's fault, right? So it's not you. You're not alone, right? Over 70% of people have it. But probably the most important thing is there is something that you can do about it, right? It's because the feeling that it's you and it's hopeless is just such a demotivating, at the very least, feeling. No, there is something you can do about it, and if you want to do something about it, you can.
Perfect. And it starts with the quiz, right? Is taking the imposter syndrome quiz and trying to find out if that is the cause.
Exactly. You know what they say, you know, medical intervention without diagnosis is malpractice. Treatment without diagnosis is malpractice. Start with a diagnosis. Start with a quiz. See if it is, if it's something that you are suffering with.
Perfect. So the website is completesuccess.co.uk, I think /quiz for the test. I answered a few of the questions just ahead of this, so I kind of have a little look into it, but I was like, oh, it might tell me that I have imposter syndrome and I may not do the podcast. So, but Tara, this has been a really good deep dive. Thank you for sharing not just the practical applications, but also some of the kind of behind the scenes, the neuroscience, the history of this. And like you say, 40 years on from this original discovery, we know it's a thing. Hopefully we can find a few different ways to tackle it in the future.
Exactly, yes.
Thanks for coming on the show, and hopefully we get to catch up again soon.
Yes, my pleasure, Dan. Thanks a lot.